This is Bob Barr, and today we're going to be discussing another in the long series of Bob Barr's Laws of the Universe. As you all probably remember from some of our earlier discussions, based primarily but not exclusively on my service in the Congress, there are a lot of things that people and institutions do or don't do that are pretty much universal. For example, as we've seen already, no matter how much power government has, it always wants more. No matter how much power government has, it never has enough. No matter how much power government takes, it always wants to take more. So there are a series of actions, activities, and principles that you can pretty much take to the bank in a sense that government is going to do certain things and people in government are going to behave in certain ways. These are indeed Bob Barr's Laws of the Universe. What we're going to be discussing today is law number 107. Law number 107 has to do with the legislative process, legislation in the Congress, the House or the Senate, how it becomes law, then it gets to the president. We're all familiar with the process itself. But in recent years, Congress has taken to doing something that is very dangerous. Dangerous for we the people. Dangerous for those of us who care about the rule of law. Dangerous for those of us who care about the right to privacy, which is embedded throughout our Bill of Rights, for example. Dangerous because hidden within some of the massive pieces of legislation that come before the Congress and those that are passed into law by being signed by the president, they often, as a matter of fact, always contain things hidden within them. For example, you all may remember reading about Obamacare. This is the law that is Obamacare. More or less, about 1,000 pages of fine print, small print, as you can see. And that isn't even the longest piece of legislation that Congress has passed in recent years. But hidden within this were almost innumerable problem areas, things that become mandates of law that affect us, that impact us, and that negatively impact our freedoms. And that's why it's so important to do everything that you can. Look at this legislation. Watch what Congress is doing. And it's hard. Going through this type of legislation, even members of Congress, when I was in the Congress, it was impossible. It would have been impossible to read every word of every piece of legislation that came before me for consideration or a vote. Of course, that's one reason why you try and have very good staff to assist with this. It's why it's very important to stay in touch with your constituents. Because your constituent groups out there, if they're doing their job as an informed citizenry, and you're doing your job as a representative of those citizens, you have good communication. But however you do it, pay attention to what Congress is doing, because hidden within these things are provisions that will dramatically, sometimes irreparably harm our individual liberties. We see it in several years ago, Congress passed the Real ID Act. Hidden within there are several provisions that harm our privacy rights. Hidden within, just take this bill. This is the Obamacare bill, supposed to deal with health care, right? Well, you turn, this is just one example, you turn towards the end here and you find out that Obamacare passed into law a tax on indoor tanning services. Yeah, in a sense, that's funny that a bill that has to do with healthcare and dramatically changes the nature of healthcare in our country has stuck in it a provision that raises taxes on tanning services. But it's just one very small example of how things get stuck into legislation, particularly these long pieces of legislation that dramatically affect our individual rights, our liberties, and the powers of government that need to be restrained. There's actually another trick that you need to watch out for that Congress uses. We talk about these huge pieces of legislation, and that gives them opportunity to stick in there all sorts of problematic issues, problematic provisions. But there's another trick that they use, and that is to include within what they call a must-pass piece of legislation something that is what's known as a poison pill, or something that is not really good, but they stick it within a piece of legislation, usually an appropriations bill, the defense appropriation. That's a favored vehicle for people in Washington because they know that we have to have funding for our national defense. So when the time comes around for that national defense or military appropriations bill to pass, which is must pass, guess what? That's an opportunity for these folks in Washington to stick in there things that often have nothing to do with military appropriations. But since that bill has to pass, so we have national defense, so our men and women in uniform get paid, they might stick in there something like the Real ID Act. The Real ID Act, which a lot of people were opposed to, including yours truly, was stuck into a must-pass piece of legislation. A lot of folks didn't even realize it. So that's another reason to pay special attention every year, particularly at the time when Congress passes their appropriations bills, which they often do in one massive piece of legislation. Stay in touch with groups that you trust and with your member of Congress or your senator to the best you can to make sure that they're paying attention to what's in there. And if they're not, remind them that that's a fundamental duty and responsibility of members of Congress. And if they don't, vote against them, work against them. It's that important. And that's why it's an honor for me and a pleasure to have these discussions with you about Bob Barr's Laws of the Universe. We look today at law number 107. There's many others we'll be looking at in our sessions to come. Thank you for being with us.